The content discussed in this episode may be specific to the guest's organisation or location and may not be applicable to other organisations, states, territories or countries. The material presented in this podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered health, legal or financial advice. Medical administration is a rewarding profession, but it comes with challenges. So what is it like, and what should you do if confronted with a monumental administrative difficulty? This is the podcast that takes unfortunate scenarios and explores the essentials of clinical governance to find solutions. I'm Dr David Rankin, a very experienced medical administrator and lead fellow with the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators. And this is Safeguarding Healthcare, the essentials of clinical governance. Today, continuing professional development dilemmas.
Medicine is continuously evolving, and that means that we need to continually develop throughout our careers.
That's Dr Greg Waters, the Continuing Professional Development Coordinator of the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators and a urologist. And I'm presenting him with a difficult scenario.
An unwillingness to complete the program is concerning, as it may indicate that the practitioner is stagnating and is falling behind current practice.
In today's scenario, a semi-retired physician works one day a week at your hospital, mainly undertaking outpatient assessments in his particular area of interest. He is well respected and delights young trainees with anecdotes drawn from his vast experience. When you review his paperwork for credentialing, you notice that he is not up to date with his continuing professional development. When you mention this to him, he indicates that although he reads several journals and attends hospital M&M meetings, he feels too old to be involved in these modern requirements like learning plan, reflective practice and peer review. I started by asking Dr Waters what issues this scenario raises.
This isn't an uncommon scenario, which we've certainly seen since CPD has been more formalised. But I'd have to say at the start that as doctors, our goal must always be to provide the best possible care for our patients. Medicine is continuously evolving, and that means that we need to continually develop throughout our careers. And that's from first day as a student until the day you retire. So completing a formal CPD program demonstrates that you are maintaining your professional development. And an unwillingness to complete the program is concerning, as it may indicate that the practitioner is stagnating and is falling behind current practice. The excuse that the practitioner is too old raises more concerns for me because it's the people at the end of your career, like me, where maintaining standards becomes even more important and perhaps a bit more difficult, but it is important. So I think that this is quite a concerning scenario.
So let's start with the big picture. What is CPD? What are the requirements? What's changed recently?
CPD, and there's a lot of literature around the world about changes to CPD. Several years ago, the Medical Council of New Zealand and the Medical Board of Australia made evidence of continuing education rather than of professional development mandatory, and that was a mandatory requirement to renew registration. What's happened is that we've moved away from continuing medical education to continuing professional development. And what that means is that rather just keeping up literature, going to conferences, increasing your education, you must now also continue to improve and to develop the other domains of practice. Things like professionalism, communication, being an advocate, being a leader, and all of this within a framework of cultural safety and health equity. So what's happened is that the Medical Council of New Zealand and the Medical Board of Australia have now changed the CPD requirements over the last 2 years. And education actually remains an important component, obviously, but practitioners must now also undertake a review and reflection on their practice and that includes making a professional development plan every year. And they must also do audits of their practice or find ways of measuring and improving their outcomes. And all told, the requirements for registration are a total of 50 hours of CPD activities, but they're now spread over the categories of education, practice review, and the measurement and improvement of outcomes.
So does the continuous professional development have to align with your specialty? As a medical administrator, can I go to a lecture on prostate surgery and heart disease and call that CPD?
I don't think you can call that CPD. But CPD is a broad church, and rather than looking at your specialty, we're now looking at your practice. So things like stress and lifestyle management and executive coaching, they can certainly improve your practice in domains other than education. So they're appropriate for CPD, but doing CPD in a subject that's completely unrelated to your practice, I won't go. It's a bit nuanced. I've been discussing with an administrator who was having problems with their Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and they did a little refresher course on obstetrics, which they felt would improve their ability to talk to the specialists and to manage the problems. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. If that's going to improve your practice, that's fine. So it's there. The underlying thing, though, is that there has to be a mixture. It has to be a well-rounded. One activity is never going to be enough, so you have to look at education, practice review and improvement of outcomes, as we mentioned.
So who polices compliance, makes sure that doctors have actually completed their CPD requirements?
It is well policed. The colleges and CPD homes are required by the Australian Medical Council to audit their doctors, and they also must inform the medical board if doctors who are enrolled in their program have not achieved the requirements. On top of that, there is even further auditing done by the APRA itself. So APRA will look at a number of people each year to see that they have completed it, not only to audit them, but to audit how well the college program is going.
You mentioned CPD homes. Tell us about CPD homes.
Fortunately, in Australia and New Zealand, our medical colleges have always supported their members by providing resources for continuing development. But a surprisingly number of practitioners are not associated with a college. And over the years, these doctors have had to develop their own learning programs. And in this situation, it has been difficult to know how effective that is, if it's of a high standard and if it's appropriate for the practitioner. And it was argued that some groups of doctors were falling between the cracks, weren't really being reviewed to see if they were achieving development. A quick example is that there's a growing number of doctors in Australia who stay on in the hospital system as hospitalists, and in New South Wales we call them career medical officers, and they really had no framework in which they could do their education. To counter this, the medical board has said that all doctors, not just doctors in specific groups, that all doctors must nominate a home which is an accredited CPD provider, and they must fulfil the requirements of that nominated home to gain re-registration. And this has only been introduced in the last 2 years, so it is a project under development, but it does seem to be improving the number of people who are actually achieving good CPD results. All the colleges in Australia and New Zealand have been accredited as homes, and there are now a number of commercial and non-commercial providers who also can be used as a home.
Thanks, Greg. Let's come back to the scenario where we've got a very respected elderly physician who's not compliant with his CPD. How would you go about ensuring that the care that they provide is safe and aligned with current practice?
Well, certainly this unwillingness to undertake the mandatory requirements does raise a red flag. And I think initially very much go through the hospital's governance processes to see if there's any evidence that the practitioner isn't performing safely. Are there any poor results? Are there any complaints that are forming a concerning pattern? And certainly I'd recruit the doctor's head of department at this stage, who should have an overview of how he is performing and discuss with the head of department the situation. And if there's evidence that he isn't safe, then obviously fairly direct action has to be taken, that as you would with anyone who has a pattern of complaints and poor outcomes. But that may not be the case. He may be practising quite well, but we don't know that yet.
So what are you going to do?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, the current registration requirements are certainly much more rigorous than they were. But when you look at them, for a clinician who's in active practice, they're quite easy to achieve. And I suspect, and my experience has been, that often the clinicians have only taken a very superficial look at the requirements and they've thrown their hands up and said, this is too hard, I'm too old, I'm not going to do it anymore. So I think the first thing I'll do is, together with the head of department, I'll talk to the clinician, provide an explanation and provide these information on the sort of support that we can do so that he will be compliant with his requirements. And I would then seek an undertaking from him that he is going to complete his CPD program.
What happens if he says, no, it's just too hard?
Yeah. Well, in that case, under the current regulations, he will eventually not be re-registered. And obviously, if that happens, he will automatically lose his position with the hospital and no longer be a practicing doctor. So I think at this stage, it would be also wise to say to him, look, after all the work you've done for us, why don't you retire? We'll give you a farewell and you'll be remembered very well. But if you stay on, you're going to be forced into losing your position and you want to avoid that humiliation.
Yeah. We see CPD as an individual obligation, that it's up to the individual person to complete their CPD. Do you think the hospital has any role in assisting or making it easier for them?
Oh, absolutely. And the range of support that a hospital can give its practitioners is very strong. If we look at the three categories in education, normally you have grand rounds, you have departmental scientific meetings, and even being part of student and registrar training is considered to be part of the education portfolio of the education categories. And also, in most jurisdictions, staff specialists have a leave and education allowance, which they can certainly use towards their CPD. But also, a well-functioning department will provide peer support and M&M meetings, and these are an excellent way of doing practice review. And I'd also expect in a well-functioning department that the head of department would have a conversation with each of their practitioners once a year, having a look at their performance and their future aspirations. And that in New Zealand, that's a compulsory part of the CPD component for practice review. In Australia, it's not compulsory, but it is highly recommended. So practice reviews can be done as far as doing an audit of your practice. Usually within a hospital, the compliance and governance units are very keen to do measuring and improving outcomes. They've got a lot of data and they could certainly, and they would be willing to help the practitioner do an audit of their practice or do a quality improvement project.
Medical administrators traditionally had to approve CPD. You get the form coming through and I want to go to this town on this date and attend this conference. Many states have now just wrapped that CPD allowance into the base salary of the doctors. Is that a positive or a negative?
Oh, it's an absolute negative. It is a bad thing. Having a CPD allowance certainly gives clinicians an incentive to undertake CPD because I think in most jurisdictions it's a case of use it or lose it. So if you don't use it within a year or two, you've lost that enticement to work. When I was in that sort of situation as a staff specialist, the allowance was highly valued and I used it to look towards activities that I thought could help my practice. We've all got multiple claims on our salaries and CPD might actually be put in the lower half of priorities if it is just rolled into the salary. So certainly I think it's a bad thing that that allowance is beginning to disappear.
There's a common perception that medical conferences are an excuse for doctors to take their families on vacation to some exotic location at the hospital's expense. How can you be assured that the CPD activity actually adds value to the hospital?
Yes, we've got the old dilemma of whether it's Aspen in January or Paris in August.
Yes.
And I think that perception was certainly one of the factors that caused APRA to actually look at reforming CPD, so that rather than concentrating on continuing education, which conferences were all about, and being an excuse for a junket, it's argued that CPD should cover all aspects of the doctor's development. So now, at the very most, only 50% of registered CPD can be in conferences. But taking junket can still be a problem, and most hospital systems do have procedures to ensure that the hospital only supports activities relevant to the doctor's practice and the use of the hospital. But of course, what the doctor does once it gets to the exotic locations is another thing, but you would hope he'd at least turn up at the conference as part of his trip. Interestingly, in New South Wales certainly, and I think in most jurisdictions which continue to have a CPD allowance, there's a requirement under the doctor's award that he should present his learnings to his peers and the administration. I've never actually seen that enforced, but certainly if it is an issue, you could make sure that that part of the award was enforced.
I know when my kids relocated overseas, both of them said, "Oh, Dad, there's lots of conferences in the town. You can come and visit."
That's fine, provided you go to the conference. It's a worthwhile conference.
Let's talk about the difference between public and private. Doctors working in public are employees, whereas doctors in private settings are not. They're individual practitioners. How does CPD differ between public and private?
The requirements don't differ at all. And all practicing doctors, even if you are a locum who's doing the bare minimum to retain recency, which is the equivalent of one full-time equivalent month per year, you have to meet the same standards as someone who's a full-time staff specialist. So the requirements are the same, but yes, certainly the opportunities or the support may be different. And it's recognised that individual doctors who are in solo practice may have difficulty meeting some of the requirements. They certainly don't have the same support that a person who's employed in a major hospital has. But they're the people who need CPD more than many others, because being in an isolated practice, you can certainly lose your recency and being up to date. So it's important for doctors in that situation to do it. But the most important thing for everyone doing CPD is to have a professional development plan. At the beginning of the year, take time to reflect on your practice. What are you doing well? What aren't you doing so well? What areas do you want to develop? And from that development plan, work out which activities you need to do. And that's, I think, for everyone, that's the secret to make sure that you make CPD worthwhile.
We talked about peer review and self-audit. It's relatively easy with a surgeon. A surgeon can track their infection rate, their outcomes, their length of stay, their return to hospital, all sorts of issues. It can be much more challenging for physicians, particularly, say, palliative care physicians, where a high proportion of their patients are expected to die, or non-clinical specialists like medical administration or public health, where the outcomes can be very hard to determine. How do you set up a self-audit for these more challenging clinicians?
This was certainly an argument that was put forward when the reforms to CPD were being considered. But our experience over the last 2 years has shown that this concern was misplaced. Practice review can also be a little bit of a problem for people who are practice by themselves, who aren't in a practice group. But in that case, finding a peer review group or having a conversation with a colleague or a peer will achieve requirements for practice review. Looking at audit, the third activity is actually not just measure activity, it's measure and improve activities. So, yeah, I agree. For procedurists, it's relatively easy to do that, to take an audit in your practice. But for people who can't do that, this group also includes quality improvement projects. And as leaders and managers, we do quality improvement every day, all day. So it's not difficult for us. And in most practices, you can find somewhere where you could do a quality improvement project. So I think the concern about this when the reforms came in was very much misplaced. It's been relatively easy for non-clinical doctors to actually achieve the requirements.
Perhaps a really hard question is, given the intent or the essence of what CPD is all about, what would you see as an ideal CPD program for a doctor to be able to maintain their knowledge and skills?
I've got to agree. We've spent this talk talking about the stick, the registration compliance requirements, where the beauty of it and the best thing is the carrot. Doing CPD, developing not just for the benefit of your patients, but also for your own benefit, to look towards excellence and to improve your performance. and hopefully this will happen now that the reforms are in, is that we need to move away from box ticking and quantity and start looking towards the quality of our CPD. And I have to reiterate, the most important thing is we're adults, we know what's the best thing for our practice, but the only way to document that is to actually make a professional development plan every year. So the professional development plan also, rather than being a tick box, must have a lot of reflection into it and actually point the way for the coming year. And the PDP is a living document. As the year progresses, you record your successes, your failures, and your changing circumstances. And it repeats every year. So the cycle starts with doing a professional development plan every year. When introducing the new requirements, APRA certainly looked into the movement away from medical education to professional development. So the framework that we've got, I think, is an excellent framework. It's certainly world standard. But what you do with the framework depends on how much you put into it. And to get the most out of CPD, it requires a commitment to excellence from the practitioner. But within the framework, I think things can be very good.
Thanks, Greg. Great summary of what CPD is all about. At the end of the day, we have that mandate to first do no harm. You have to know what harm you're creating and then actively work to reduce it. Any final comments or observations on this scenario?
I was going to make an observation, and it is quite a difficult aspect of the scenario, but there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment, not only in Australia but worldwide, about ageing doctors. And it's pointed out that once you get to a certain age in Australia, you actually have to undergo new testing and medical review before you get a driver's licence. But what about a doctor who's over the age of, the arbitrary number that's put out there is 70? There's certainly evidence that as you get past that age, there are concerns about safety and continuing recency and so on. So it's a discussion at the moment. A decision hasn't been made, but certainly APRA is looking at introducing a requirement for all practitioners over the age of 70 to have a medical assessment before they're re-registered each year and have that medical assessment as part of their CPD. And I think in this scenario, obviously, that may be of value. It may be important.
That was Dr. Greg Waters, the Continuing Professional Development Coordinator here at RACMA and a urologist. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Safeguarding Healthcare. I'm Dr. David Rankin. Follow Safeguarding Healthcare free on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is produced by Sound Cartel for the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators.